Up next in our look at the New York Giants 2023 draft picks is the first of two seventh-round draft picks, defensive lineman Jordon Riley. And to help us break everything down, we'll be hearing from Locked On Ducks host Spencer McLaughlin. That's coming your way next on the Locked On Giants podcast.
You are Locked On Giants, your daily New York Giants podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Today's episode of the Locked On Giants podcast is brought to you by FanDuel Sportsbook, the official sportsbook of the NFL. Make every moment more. Visit FanDuel.com/LockedOn today to get started. Hello, New York Giant fans, and welcome to another edition of the Locked On Giants podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast family, your team every day. I'm your host, Patricia Traina, and we are continuing our look at the New York Giants class of 2023. We're looking at each individual draft pick that the Giants selected last weekend, and we are going to the people who know them the best right now, and those are the hosts of the college programs at which these players participated in. So on today's program, we are going to take a look at one of the Giants' two seventh-round draft picks, defensive lineman Jordon Riley out of Oregon. And here to help me break down Riley's game, what he brings to the table, is the host of Locked On Ducks. He's also the host of Locked On Pac-12. He is Spencer McLaughlin. Spencer, thanks so much for joining me.
Hey, great to be here.
All right, Spencer, let's start off with an overview. Who is Jordon Riley? What does he bring to the table?
He brings a lot of experience at the Power 5 level to the table for the Giants. Not surprising that he was taken where he was. Guy who spent 6 years in college playing college football. So he's kind of the Hendon Hooker of defensive linemen, if you will. So he's somebody who began his career at Nebraska, played just this last one with the Ducks, and came over and was a solid contributor, not a big stats guy. It can be hard to generate stats as an interior defensive lineman, but he was part of an Oregon defense that had its ups and downs, but was also one of the best teams in the Pac-12 defending the run. I think that's primarily about your defensive tackles and your linebackers. And that's, something Oregon did well up until the final game of the year against Oregon State, which was all a disaster and whatnot. But Riley was right at the center of it. And he came over from Nebraska after having been there for 5 years and played college football for 5 years, was in school for 6, got the extra COVID year and whatnot. And it's just a really, really big guy. Like he's hard to miss, even when you put him up against other Power 5 players or put him up against other draft picks. He is a really, really big dude, definitely a space absorber. I think that's kind of his best attribute there. And someone who, didn't blow us away at Oregon in the 1 year that he played in Eugene, but certainly was someone who we weren't surprised. We expected him to start. He did start all season long, and we weren't, calling for his job or anything like that as the season progressed. So just a really, really solid college football player.
All right. So as I understand it, Jordon Riley transferred to Oregon, didn't really play much previously. Where did his game, though? I mean, based on what you know about his game before he came to the Ducks, where did his game really take off, or was it just a matter of finding his niche for him once he got to Oregon?
Well, he came over with Tony Tuioti and Casey Rogers from Nebraska, Oregon's defensive line coach. So that was part of the reason I think that he transferred, was because he had that familiarity with his position coach and felt like there was a good path to playing time, which there certainly was. I think in terms of what his game is, as I alluded to earlier, it's really about his size. He's not going to blow you away with his technique necessarily. He's not going to blow you away with his speed. He's not an explosive playmaker. He's a guy who's going to go in the middle of your defense. He's going to do the grunt work. He's going to work hard. And he's going to, at his best, be a guy who absorbs double teams and creates lanes for your linebackers to come up and stop the run at or around the line of scrimmage. That's kind of the crux of what he brings to the table, because there weren't even really that many impact plays that I can think of from Oregon's 2022 season that he was a part of, but he was one of the leading snap getters for the Ducks along the defensive line. And it's just one of those unsung heroes. Not surprising that a guy who certainly has NFL size, I don't think there's any question or reservations about that, but I think he's somebody who, understands what his role is. And I think fans should understand the role that he's capable of playing in the NFL.
Where's his best position? I think he's lined up as a zero tech. I think he's done some one tech work, if I'm not mistaken, a little bit, some shade work, but where's his best position, do you think?
So in Oregon's defensive system last year, they ran a 4-2-5, and he was consistently one of those interior defensive tackles. I think he's big enough. If you wanted to, you could play him at nose guard. I don't know if he's sufficiently dominant by NFL standards, at least at the collegiate level. And look, we've seen guys before get the right coaching after their college careers once they get to the NFL and really start to take off and pop, right? I mean, it's more true at a position like quarterback. A great example is Justin Herbert, of course, who a lot of people had skepticism about when he was in college, but the offensive staff he was working for wasn't very good. He gets to the NFL, gets coaching at the Chargers, which wasn't even that great, but was still NFL level, and he pops in a big way. That happens for position players as well, where, they don't maximize their full potential in college because there are just elements to the NFL that are different. The position coaches, I feel like, have a good understanding of how to get the most out of a particular player. So if you wanted to line him up at nose tackle, I think you certainly can. He's big enough to do that. But what he's most familiar with is being one of two interior defensive linemen and kind of being a part of that four-man front. Of course, you have another former Duck, Kayvon Thibodeau, on the edge on one side. But I think Riley is a guy that I'd be pretty surprised if he started regularly for the Giants, but I think he's someone who you bring in as a rotation piece. I think he's someone who can be a part of a goal line package as well. If you want to put some extra big bodies in there, I think that's kind of where he can slide in, where he can be best served. But if you're relying on him to be a starter and be a highly productive player, I think that's asking a little bit too much of him.
Yeah, certainly for the rookie campaign, given the lack of experience. I think he's had less than 600 snaps at the college level combined, if I'm not mistaken.
Yeah, it hasn't been a huge number. I don't have the number in front of me, but he was a guy who played some at Nebraska and was just on campus. I think the appeal for Oregon again was his size and experience in the weight room, right? Just being a Power 5 ready body type, NFL style body type, as we now see, who can come in and not need a ton of work and a ton of development as well. He showed, I think his best game was probably Oregon's best defensive game of the year against Utah. A lot of guys played really well, but he had he had a good game, had a couple pressures up the middle, got his hand on a pass or two from Utah's Cam Rising. That was, I think, the biggest singular game impact that he had all season. But I think this was the most he's played in a year in terms of comparing it to all the seasons that he had over at Nebraska. And I think that's a good thing if you're a Giants fan, because you want someone who's shown that he's capable of doing more than he was doing in his role when he was a Cornhusker. And he showed himself again, solid, nothing special, but I never felt like, when he was at Oregon that he was getting moved around all the time, right? Like he was not capable of, holding his own, or that he was getting driven back 3 or 4 yards on every play. I never felt that way either. And for a guy that size, that's about what you'd expect. And I think a 7th round draft pick is probably an appropriate grade for him.
Hey, Giant fans, the NBA playoffs are in full swing and they're really heating up. Make a fast break to FanDuel during the NBA playoffs, because right now new customers can get a no sweat first bet up to $1,000. That's $1,000 back in bonus bets if your first bet does not win. There's no better place to bet on all the playoff action than America's #1 sportsbook. Visit FanDuel.com/lockedon and get a no sweat first bet up to $1,000. That's FanDuel.com/lockedon. FanDuel, the official sports betting partner of the NBA. How is he in terms of his mobility? Is he a guy, we think of Dexter Lawrence, for example. He's a guy with good mobility, despite being, a guy with size. I mean, how is Riley in that regard?
Not the most fleet of foot. I think he's a guy that is going to do more against the run than he is against the pass. But if he, breaks through the line of scrimmage and gets to a quarterback, I wouldn't expect him to, Leonard Williams style, track a quarterback down and keep up with some of the mobile guys that you see around the NFL nowadays at a high level. I think he's somebody who, may do that from time to time, but unless it's Kirk Cousins back there, you're probably not going to have a ton of opportunities for him to generate sacks. But the thing with him is he never looked like he was out of position. He never looked like he misunderstood his assignment, that he misunderstood his role. I think, even though this was his most productive and most snap heavy season in 2022 at Oregon, I think you're getting a guy who has a pretty darn good football IQ, which you don't think about a lot for a defensive lineman, but the wherewithal of understanding, when the offensive linemen are letting up because there's a screen pass, the wherewithal to understand gap assignments or blitzes or all that sort of stuff. I think he's someone who knows what he needs to do in those situations very well. And I think that's part of what makes him such a solid football player, in spite of not being the world's most explosive athlete.
In terms of, his play on the defensive line, you've got guys who are big bodies, but they absorb blocks. And then you get guys who take up multiple blockers. Where does his game currently fall?
He can do a little bit of both. I wouldn't say he's, particularly a specialized player at one or the other. But I think when you look at a guy of his size, I think he's about 6'6", 320 or so in that sort of range. I think he's someone who can be a factor in the run game. I think is where he can grow. Sorry if that's one of the questions you were going to ask later, but where he can grow is getting a bigger array of moves and better use of his hands. So another defensive lineman that Oregon has by the name of Brandon Dorlus will be an NFL draft selection next year. And he's a really good interior defensive lineman. And the reason Brandon Dorlus is so good is he uses his hands as well as any defensive tackle I've ever seen come through the Ducks. Like the last great defensive tackle, not defensive end, but defensive tackle was, there were a couple, DeForest Buckner, Eric Armstead were really good. But the first great one I remember was Haloti Ngata. And Haloti Ngata just kind of bull rushed people. Like he had great hands. He used them really well, but he was just a physically imposing player and a ridiculous athlete. And I think for Riley, where he can kind of take a next step is to be more productive in the passing game and be a guy who uses his hands a lot better to get by. Because I think he's reliant on his size to just kind of bull rush guys. And I don't have full insight on whether or not it was part of the scheme for him to, try and get by a guard or center, or whether or not he was trying to take up space, contain the quarterback. Like there are different assignments within a defensive line scheme, depending on what your defensive play call is. But I think that's where he has room for growth, is getting after the quarterback, developing more moves, which basically, as we've learned from Aaron Donald, is just all about how you can kind of get you can tell I never played defensive line. I'm 5'8.5", so that's obvious. But the way you can do those quick moves to kind of duck under or shed a block, I think that's where he can improve the most. And I definitely say the strength of his game right now is defending the run.
What about the intangibles to his game? What kind of teammate is he? What kind of demeanor is he? Obviously you've got some guys who are very vocal, very, animated, like a Thibodeau might be on the field. And
Yeah.
you've got some guys who are, just go back to the huddle afterward. Where does Riley fall into the spectrum?
I think he's pretty quiet. I don't know if he ever did a media session. He might have once or twice, but because he wasn't a guy who was putting up a bunch of stats, I don't think he was ever, made available to the media. He's not a guy who was talked about a ton. He's not a guy who was criticized a ton, which can be a good thing. The best defensive backs, I always say, are the ones who you don't talk about, because if you're not talking about them, that means they're doing their job, particularly with safeties. If a safety's name pops up all the time, it's probably because that guy's getting cooked on every other play, and fans are frustrated with it. But Riley, definitely a head down, hard worker, positive reputation, no indication whatsoever that he's got any sorts of drama or any sorts of off the field issues, locker room problems, anything like that. There's been nothing based on the 1 year he had at Oregon and the 5 he had at Nebraska. I think he brings that sort of maturity that you would expect from somebody like that. I think that's what he brings to the table, and someone who, as I was talking about earlier in terms of play style, understands his role. I think he's going to understand that he's still got work to do, based on what we saw from him in a year at Oregon. I think he understands he needs to improve, that there are areas where he can continue to grow to, make it for many, many years in the NFL. But the good news is when you're 6'6", 320 pounds, you will get the opportunity to do so.
Were you surprised that he went drafted as opposed to being an undrafted free agent, given the fact that, yes, he's got size, but he also doesn't have that experience? So, I mean, obviously, you talked about the size is very appealing, but were you still surprised that he made it into the draft?
Well, he's got the experience. He just doesn't have the production, I think, is what's kind of missing from being a typical NFL draft pick. And I will say I was a little bit surprised when you consider that it was in the 7th round. Definitely less so. I don't think it was a wasted draft pick by any means, because I think you've seen in the NFL, whether it's a quarterback or any other position, they are willing, going back to the coaching discussion we were having earlier and getting the most out of your players, they are willing in the NFL, almost across the league, to take a guy who they feel has the physical capabilities of being productive, of being a good player, and molding him into their vision of what the best version of that player really looks like. So when you have the size and strength and, just the reps in the weight room, right? It's not like he is a 20-year-old or 21-year-old kid. Like he is a grown man coming out of college pretty much. I think he's 24, 25 years old. So maybe not grown man, because then that make me a grown man, and I'm definitely not. But I think he's somebody who I did not expect to get drafted. But if you told me he was, I'd say, hey, he's probably like a 6th, 7th round flyer or something in that area. And that's kind of what it feels like here for the Giants.
The consistency in coaching, though, you mentioned that he came over to the Ducks with his defensive line coach, I guess, that he had in Nebraska. Yeah. I mean, do you think that was a benefit for him to receive the same coaching, even though maybe the scheme might have been tweaked a little bit?
Yeah, I'd say so. I think that comfort level for kids in college football is really big. You see it in the transfer portal just all the time. Is players, feel like they are committing to play for schools, yes, but mostly for coaches. And that's why when one coach leaves, you see a flock of players go with him, because that player is, they've already got a relationship with that coach. They know what to expect from the playing time. They know what to expect schedule-wise. They know what to expect scheme-wise. They've got that ingrained familiarity. Like, there's just a lot of comfort with that. And I think it's time in Nebraska just kind of run its course. And he wasn't a super heralded recruit in the portal when he came over to Oregon. And then he turned into a guy who wasn't a super heralded player, but was a solid player and was a contributor to the defense and did some nice things at times. I'm not looking at Oregon's defensive line this year and saying, man, we really, really miss Jordon Riley, but I also am not glad to see him go. Like, if he had stayed, he probably would have been a starter or at the very least within the 2 deep. And defensive tackles rotate as much as any position on the football field. He would have been in that mix once again. And I think the coaching element is just kind of what you see in college nowadays. His old Nebraska teammate, Casey Rogers, did the same thing where he followed Tony Tuioti to Oregon because he knew what he was going to get there. And Casey Rogers also a really, really solid player on the defensive line for the Ducks. So I think that all made a lot of sense for Jordon Riley. And, Tony Tuioti probably told him, hey, if you come to Oregon, you can play more than you did in Nebraska. And he did. And that's clearly worked out for him as he's parlayed that into being an NFL draft pick.
You mentioned that Riley is a little older than your typical senior. I call them super seniors because,
Yes.
Obviously the COVID years, the extra years of eligibility.
He is a super duper senior.
Super duper senior. That being said, is there a noticeable, do you notice a maturity level in his game that, maybe for the average senior might not be there?
Yeah, I think I never remembered a moment this year where I felt like he was getting bullied, not like by other offensive linemen. I don't mean by his teammates or anything like that. But I never remember a moment where he was way out of position. I never remember a moment where he made a dramatic mistake. I think it's really indicative of his personality is you don't really notice that he's there, but that's okay given the position that he plays. Like, you don't need to always notice the defensive lineman or defensive tackle in particular is there. Edge players you do because you need him to get after the quarterback. But unless you have Aaron Donald or Fletcher Cox on the interior, there are just not that many guys, Chris Jones or the Kansas City Chiefs. There are not that many players who you can look at and say, yeah, he's making a big impact and he's playing defensive tackle. Like, mostly your job is don't get pushed off the ball, which Jordon Riley did not have happen too often last year. Swallow up some double teams, create holes for linebackers so they can go get the credit. It's like, don't be Ricky Bobby. Be, I forgot his friend's name. I haven't seen that movie, Talladega Nights, in so long. But John C. Reilly's character, right? You got to set up Ricky Bobby for the slingshot. Someone's got to do that. That's kind of what Jordon Riley is ready to do. I don't think he's the Aaron Donald type. I think he's more he held up the guard on a double team long enough for your linebacker or a blitzing safety to have a seam to get through, tackle the running back for a 2 or 3 yard gain when it would otherwise be 5 or 6. I think that's kind of where he can thrive the best for the Giants. And I think that's kind of what is mostly asked of defensive tackles. So
basically a support role is what you're saying.
Yeah. I think he's a supporting role kind of guy, which is what he was at Oregon. Right. He was far from Oregon's best defensive lineman. He was certainly far from the worst. He had a really high snap count this year. I forget exactly what it was, but he was out there far more often than he was not. And he was a regular starter and just a solid contributor, and I think has some room to grow at the NFL level, but I see no reason he can't be a solid contributor in the NFL.
Right. Now, I always like to do human interest stories on these guys, some kind of, superlative or something about their background that, just kind of defines who they are. What can you tell me about his background? Maybe an interest or maybe something he majored in? I don't know. I mean, what would make for a really good, human interest type of story with him?
Gosh, I'm trying to think. I don't know that there was one because, like I said, he wasn't a guy that was super talkative. He wasn't making noise. He wasn't, getting specifically interviewed all the time. I'm sure there might be one out there somewhere, but I think he's just really one of those under the radar, go to work, put your head down, work in an unassuming role on your team sort of guys and do whatever he can to help the team win. I'm trying to wrap my brain, but I don't think there's anything of that specific nature with him, which is not a bad thing. I don't think, because there were more than a few interest stories about Kayvon Thibodeau, and some people saw that as a drawback. And, Giants fans saw what he was all about last year. He's a butt kicker. That's kind of what he does. I remember when Thibodeau was tearing it up on, was it Monday Night Football against whatever the team in DC, the Commanders. The Commanders now. I can't keep up. But like when he was just dominating the game, a friend of mine who's an Oregon State fan texted me, and I was in a very good mood because I'd been on the Kayvon Thibodeau hype train for a long time as people were writing him off. And I was like, no, this is so stupid. This is just, it's completely media driven, overblown, all this sort of stuff. And he texted me, he was like, so I guess Kayvon Thibodeau's pretty good, huh? And I was like, yeah, I tried to tell people. I tried to tell them. Everybody wanted to say that he was not invested in football and he was too distracted and whatnot. I was like, nope, that guy is really good when he's on the field. He's got interests off the field. Yep, totally does. Steph Curry's a scratch golfer. Damian Lillard's got rap albums. These guys do other stuff and they can still be near the top of their craft. But Jordon Riley doesn't have anything like that at this point in time. And for him, I think that it clearly works.
Yeah, I mean, to each his own. And KT, by the way, is quite the character. All right, Spencer, final question for you about Jordon Riley. What is one thing we haven't touched upon that you feel Giant fans should know about this young man?
Ooh, one thing that we haven't touched upon. That there's just as high a likelihood he ends up never cracking the rotation as there is he becomes not just a starter, but a Pro Bowl caliber player. I don't think that this is a guy whose ceiling is tremendously high. And I think given, what I saw from him at Oregon in 1 year, I'd say in the NFL, I could see him being someone who maybe doesn't make it or doesn't see the field a ton. But my best guess for him is he's a rotational defensive lineman. That would be my most honest prediction about what he becomes for the Giants. A rotational defensive lineman. A starter, you could find guys that are better than him, but you could also probably find guys that are worse than him and that don't have the size that he does. But I don't think you should expect him to take a huge leap and become some Pro Bowl level defensive lineman. But I wouldn't be shocked if, in 2 years, for instance, they decided to move on from him, or if he just, wasn't playing all the time, because he just never showed even really flashes of dominance at Oregon. So it's going to be a very tape heavy job for him, in that the tape that the GM and all of his staff study week in and week out is going to determine whether or not, like, looking at this snap and how did that snap go and what's that and the other thing, that's what's going to determine whether or not the Giants decide to commit to him long term. But I suspect he's a guy who plays out his rookie contract, probably goes and finds another team. But in those couple of years, you could maybe have a couple of decent moments from him. But I wouldn't get over your skis with excitement.
Right. I mean, 7th round draft pick. He's probably going to be a practice squatter, if anything, because they're pretty loaded right now on the defensive line, the Giants, with Ashawn Robinson and Raheem Nunez-Roches. And they also have a couple of other guys returning. So to me, it just sounds like Jordan's more of a developmental project, and we'll see where he's at next year. Cause the experience, the production, jumping around from Nebraska, then to Oregon, just probably needs a year of seasoning, probably needs to get into the weight room, improve his strength like all rookies do. And of course, get NFL level coaching with, regards to his technique, which I'm sure can be cleaned up somewhat.
Yeah, I think the technique and developing a bigger array of pass rush moves can really be a benefit for him. But if you're saying the Giants are deep on the defensive line, yeah, I could see him being more of a developmental piece. But I think that's a pretty good guy to go with, is someone who's not going to make a bunch of noise, who doesn't expect to play a lot, and who's 6'6", 320-ish pounds. So I think that it makes a lot of sense in that realm. And if Jordon Riley ends up being a rotation player this year for the Giants, I won't be surprised if he ends up, playing 20 snaps all season. That wouldn't surprise me either.
So basically, you're keeping your options open.
Yeah, I
not setting any expectations.
Yeah, I think expectations should be pretty tampered with them. But you shouldn't fully write him off and say, oh well, he's no good. He wasn't any good at Oregon. Like, he could still become that,
right?
But he might need some time to be able to do that.
Spencer, thank you so much for all the intel. I really appreciate it. It's great that we get to talk to you guys once a year. I mean, if we're lucky, we get to talk to you once a year. I know I talked to you last year about KT. Folks, you can check him out. Again, he's the host of Locked On Ducks and Locked On Pac-12. Please check out our college hosts. They do such a good job with their coverage. And it's not just football. If you're into baseball or lacrosse or hockey, or you just want to know who's coming, who's going through the transfer portals and whatnot, or signings, they're the people you want to
We got you
check
covered
out.
on the transfer portal. Let me assure you, we got everybody
I
covered on the
bet.
transfer portal. Whatever
I bet that
team you're
keeps you
looking for,
busy.
I guarantee you there's transfer portal discussion. If you scroll through a week's worth of episodes, that is a big topic all the time. So if that's what you're looking for, whatever school, by all means, check us out down on the college channel.
Definitely. And they, of course, the college folks, they are 5 days a week like us here on the Locked On NFL. So check them out, folks. You won't be sorry. So anyway, for Spencer McLaughlin, I'm Patricia Trainer. Giant fans, stay tuned. We've got more coming up on today's episode right after this. All right, Giant fans, that's actually going to do it for us here on today's Locked On Giants podcast. Hope you enjoyed the interview with Spencer McLaughlin. Make sure you tune in tomorrow when we hear all about the final draft choice of the New York Giants 2023 class, safety Gervarius Owens out of Houston. We'll hear from Locked On Cougs host Parker Ainsworth. That'll be on tomorrow's Locked On Giants podcast. We'll see you then, Giant fans.